Welcome everyone. It's another edition of our Mibby's Eye series, and this month we're talking to Graeme McCormick. Now, we've talked to Graeme McCormick before, nearly always about his whole system that he's worked out for land tax reform. This is a different topic, so he's put a lot of thought into this, and it's about routes to Scottish independence. Fiona and I were both over at Edinburgh at the march on the 2nd of September, and we bumped into Graeme, sort of ironically as it were, as we bumped into him at the same time as we were just chatting to people on the march and asking them, well, what do you think is the way forward? So here's a little snippet of some of the responses that we got. So what do you think the way forward's going to be?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible, but I don't know, it looks like referendum's kind of... Well, Labour and Tory both seeming to say, no, but...
Yeah. I think we just have to keep the pressure up.
Yeah,
show that we're sensible.
See what the turnout,
logical
see what happens
people
at this general election next year, actually. Yeah.
It's going to be quite important.
Yeah. Any ideas about the best way forward?
It's really hard to say. I think one thing that needs to happen is just more support, because as more support builds in the public, it gets harder and harder and so obviously undemocratic to say no. So I know a few people who voted no and who are yes now. And one of the things that caused that was Brexit. And I think the turnover of prime ministers went for Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. I think that was the end
and
for some people.
this one's not much better.
No.
He's kind of maybe better than them, but that's not saying very much.
It's really not saying much. And when you see what we could do here, I think the proportional representation in the Parliament is very important. It's what most countries have, most democracies have that. And it leads to stable government, and it lets people really vote for what they want.
Yes, exactly.
Our first way forward has to be the Rutherglen and Hamilton West by-election, and we have to win that. Otherwise, they'll make hay. We win that, and then we move forward. Now, First Minister in his address in Dundee did say that a majority of independent supporting MPs returned at the next general election will then kick-start the negotiations. Not a request. They've almost said no without saying no. So we go for the next democratic option, which is then returning the majority MPs, and then we start negotiations.
What do you think the way forward's going to be for us to get through? Because given all the
people, I think the peaceful movement. Do you think there's
more people bringing more people around?
I can't see any. From a political.
I don't like to say this, but demographics plays a big part in it as well. Because if you look at, I'm 60, my generation upwards, people are not supportive of independence. But if you look at the younger generation, it's quite high, and I think that they will drive it.
Unfortunately, I would like it to happen before.
Same as me.
Yes.
Yes,
I'm a bit older than 60.
Welcome back to Graeme McCormick. We've had you on the show before and delighted to have you back again. And this time you're going to share with us some of your thoughts on the way forward. And we're actually going to hand over the screen to you so you can give a presentation, and we'll come back at the end and hopefully have a wee chat.
That's lovely. My pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, Fiona. Right, well, hello, folks. As you know, the SNP is going to consider at its national conference the route map to independence. And in my opinion, it's important that the possible routes are, first of all, discussed, and that a decision is made in them. And it's very important that the members who are making this decision actually know what the legal position is. And so I have taken it upon myself to discuss with party members and other people what these possible routes might be, so that it gives some sort of opinion to the members before they make their judgment. The SNP invited branches and constituent associations to submit draft resolutions on the potential routes to Scottish independence. Unfortunately, we've had no legal opinion. The members have had no legal opinion as to what these routes might be, and there has been scant discussion about what these routes might be. First of all, what is the law? And what is the legal advice? Well, see, we haven't had the legal advice. Public international law is very different from domestic law. It's the law of the victor, and it's also the law of national self-interest. Although there are potential sanctions in some aspects of international law, by and large, it's a matter of cajoling, agreeing, and finding out what is in the best interest of each individual country. Now, as I see it, the hurdles towards independence are basically twofold. One is the process of delivering independence, and the second is a substance addressing the fear of risk, which a percentage of our population is hesitant. They might be sympathetic towards independence, but they're hesitant towards voting for it if they feel their own financial position is going to be materially adversely affected. Now, if we deal with the process first, what we've got to do is we've got to persuade the electorate, and it's what that electorate should basically be. What decides whether we have a majority vote? Is it a majority of the Scottish MPs? Is it a majority of votes cast? What are the international examples? And what is a majority? I think although the UK system is based on a majority of MPs, that's not the system that operates in Scotland at our Scottish government elections or our local government elections. And I think the international status that we would require to meet would be a majority of votes cast. That would give the international community the comfort of knowing that it has been a democratic majority vote. That's a high bar to meet, but that I think is the one that we must seek to obtain. As regards persuading the electorate, international examples, they're all over the place. Some have obtained their majority through referenda, such as happened in Norway. Some have become independent of each other without any referenda, some through the result of war, obviously. But if you look at former Czechoslovakia, they didn't have any referendum at all. It just happened as a result of the kind of votes at a Czechoslovakian election, where it wasn't even actually on. The idea of two independent states wasn't even in the manifestos of the competing political parties. So international examples are just not they're not definitive in any way of what we do. And what is a majority? Is it a majority 50 plus 1, or are we really saying, we should be kind of nearer the kind of 60%? I think, for the sake of showing a settled will, I think we really need to be plus the 55%, but that's only a view that I have. But the more that we can get, obviously, the better. Delivering independence, can the SNP deliver independence? I think Humza is planning to use that as the basis of our election manifesto for the next general election. And that largely depends on whether you believe that Scotland can become an independent country without the consent of the UK government, or do you need their consent? If you need their consent, whether from in a legal way or from a practical way, then we're no more than a pressure group. And I think that puts us in an incredibly disadvantaged position, because they just say no. But if you believe that we are a sovereign nation and we have the power, the legal power to do so through international law, then that is the way that we should prosecute the next general election, on the basis that we have the sovereignty to remove ourselves from the United Kingdom. So the options following an election vote, which basically gives a majority vote in favour of independence at the forthcoming general election, would be, first of all, there's a Section 30 agreement, which requires the UK government to give the Scottish Parliament the power to call a referendum. I don't really think that that's a possibility, but we'll go into that in a wee minute. There's appealing to the international community. There's a unilateral declaration of independence, or there's the dissolution of the Union. Now, the Section 30, as I say, it requires the UK government's cooperation, and that would then require a further referendum beyond the majority vote in the general election. And I would think that that would be a kind of unnecessary duplication, where we already have the views of the Scottish people. There's also the question of timescale. How long would it take to negotiate with the UK government to agree such a referendum? And of course, a referendum, if we did get into the position where we were granted a referendum, the performance of the Scottish government would come into play in the decisions that were being made by the electors. And given that there has been some criticism of the Scottish government's performance, either deserved or otherwise, in the last wee while, that is potentially another problematic area. We've also got to remember the Brexit influence, that having had a referendum where we voted substantially to stay in the EU, but the UK as a whole voted to come out, that the electorate may be less than happy about another referendum, which could be viewed as something along the same lines, or the outlook of it could be on the same lines as what has befallen us with Brexit. So appealing to international community, it's an interesting thing looking at geopolitics over the years. Generally speaking, the international community does not want to get involved in what they consider the internal affairs of another state. And I think this is particularly so when a state is viewed as democratic in Western eyes. So unless Angus Robertson has got in his back pocket, a letter from Emmanuel Macron or from David McAllister in Germany, that they will use all their influence and power internationally so that Scotland can become independent, then I think that is just not a starter at all. We've also got to remember that under international law, the basic premise of international law, whether we like it or not, is international self-interest, and that to appeal to other countries is probably not a particularly worthwhile event, given that they will not get involved in the decisions within an existing state unless it was actually going to significantly materially endanger their well-being. There's also our friends abroad. I mean, we have a wide diaspora. However, unlike potentially the Americans that had an influence on the eventual independence of the bulk of Ireland, the Scottish diaspora have been less forthright and organised. So I don't really think that is an option either. And there's also the UK government's reaction to an appeal to the international community. They basically are holding all the cards just now because they've got the diplomatic missions and all the rest of it, because these are reserved matters. So I don't think that's a proposition that we can really look at seriously. Unilateral declaration of independence. Now, of course, the most famous one was America, but America was a colony of the UK, and we're not a colony. There are those who say that we have been colonised in culture and all the rest of it, and there is obviously some practical application to that, but officially we are not a colony. We were part of the colonisers as part of the UK, and of course so many of the UK politicians refer to this union being a voluntary union. So, in no way from a legal point of view, as far as I can see, could we be classed as a colony. And it's colonies that have unilateral declarations of independence. There are various, obviously, international examples over the years. Everyone seems to have its own wee nuance or difference. The one that I remember going way back to when I was a kid was, of course, Rhodesia. And that had certain unfortunate connotations, to say the very least, because of basically the apartheid system which was going to operate there, and the support that Rhodesia had from South Africa during that period of time. Again, I don't think that is something that we could really contemplate. The other thing is that a UK government reaction to that would be that the UK government would be the continuing state in international law. And as a result, it would have all the rights and the responsibilities of that continuing state. And again, it would hold an awful lot of the cards which it could use against us. And of course, if we were declaring our independence, then basically that would mean that we would be more or less stating that we weren't entitled to a share in these assets or the responsibilities, indeed, of the United Kingdom and everything that follows therefrom. So again, I don't think that would be a particularly helpful thing to consider. Again, the international reaction would be, I dare say, there would be some states which would be relatively supportive of Scotland declaring its independence, but organisations such as the EU, which markets itself as a rules-based system, would be largely averse, initially at least, to the idea of a Scottish declaration of independence. We're not in the same position as the Catalans, who, because of their written constitution in Spain, which states that Spain is basically indivisible, that there could be some, shall we say, justification for the view that the EU took when they had the referendum there, albeit we could also criticise the EU because of the failure to condemn the jackpot response of the Spanish government. But again, the EU wasn't going to get involved in that. And would the Scots vote for UDI? You know, the idea of UDI is something which is quite dramatic. And again, you know, I think the Scots would be very slow to think in terms of that this was an appropriate designation for what we have to achieve. The other thing is it would be pretty uncertain and it would be messy, because we would be setting ourselves adrift without any call on the shared institutions of the United Kingdom, and these would all have to be set up very, very quickly. And as a result of that, between that and also trying to build up an international relationship formally, would make things extremely messy, and I don't think that is on the table either. The fourth one is dissolution of the Union. There are basically two options here. One is to negotiate after a positive majority vote, and one is to negotiate before a positive majority vote. And if we take the first one first, the dissolution of the Union, what that basically is based on international law. The United Kingdom was formed by the Treaty of Union. And within that right was the right to have Scottish MPs sit at Westminster. That is the right which was conferred on them. So if the Scottish MPs withdrew from Westminster, then that in effect is the dissolution of the Union under international law. That would then require these Scottish MPs to form a provisional government in Scotland. In addition to that, there would be the reaction of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Now, I'm not calling it the former UK or the rest of the UK, our UK, because it's not. The UK would cease to exist, but there would be two partners. One would be Scotland and the other would be NOANI, England, Wales and Northern Ireland for short. There would also be the monarch's role here, what Charles's response would be to this dissolution. And although he's probably on current forum, probably realises that if Scotland becomes independent within a fairly short period of time, we may well be deciding on an alternative head of state. But, you know, if he wanted any hope of he and his successors being head of state of Scotland and independent Scotland, then he would be well advised to tell NOANI to cooperate in the dissolution of the Union. But that remains to be seen. In international law, dissolution of the Union is a perfectly valid thing to do. There have been various examples of it over the many centuries. Probably the one that we think of most is the dissolution of the former state of Czechoslovakia, which was carried out incredibly smoothly and indeed without any referenda in either the Czech Republic or Slovakia. They just drifted apart very, very quickly as a result of an election in Czechoslovakia. And within about 6 months, they had basically decided the main elements of how they would dissolve. And it is quite interesting, despite the fact that they agreed all these things, there are still certain things which they're still working through all these years later. But everyone is different. But dissolution of the Union is certainly something which is very possible. And in fact, the Vienna Convention, there's been 2 or 3 Vienna Conventions, but they actually even allow for how assets and responsibilities can be split in the event of a dissolution and in the event of a dissolution where there is no agreement. So that's what can happen. So there is provision in international law. Now, given that the Treaty of Union was signed many centuries ago, the convention doesn't actually apply legally. The Vienna Conventions are supposed to only apply to agreements which were set up after the Vienna Convention. So strictly speaking, although Britain is a signatory to them, they wouldn't specifically apply. But basically, the Vienna Convention codified most of the customary and accepted international law, which had applied from international agreements going way back, to classical times even. So it's a body of law which is not the same as domestic law. It's largely law either of the victor or of national self-interest and built up over many centuries. So, negotiating after a positive majority vote, as I said at the convention in Dundee to the SNP, what if we get a majority of votes, but the UK government either refuses to negotiate or just says no? What do we do? It's very difficult to negotiate with somebody that's not prepared to negotiate. And what could we possibly negotiate if they're not prepared to negotiate? It might be that they might change their tune. And if so, we then have to negotiate on the division of assets and responsibilities, and also what we do with the institutions, the common institutions, Bank of England, DVLA, Diplomatic Corps, all that kind of stuff. And then again, how long would it take to agree it? It may well be that, we're not dealing with nice Mr. Cameron, who agreed in the Edinburgh Agreement of a transition period. So we don't know how long that's a transition period, if any, would be, and how obstructive or difficult or otherwise Inwani government would be in that respect. And also the fact that Inwani would want to be the continuing state under international law so that it could retain it's what it might consider its prestigious position in NATO, in the UN, the Security Council, and all the other sort of international agreements in which it is party to. So that would be something which would motivate them, and that would obviously have to be something within the agreement, and that might actually be a bit of a sticking point, we don't know. So what if the UK government doesn't agree? As I say, what do we do? What do we do if they refuse to negotiate and we've already got a positive majority vote? At that stage, we've got to decide whether, we just dissolve anyway or not. But as I say, the time scale in that case is as long as a piece of string. There's also the international reaction to what we are doing at that stage. If we're talking about, a year after the majority vote, or 2 years, or 2.5, 3 years, or whatever, politics and geopolitics may well have changed. Economics of countries, etc., may have changed. So I think it is a very dangerous thing to consider negotiating after a positive vote, because I think we may well end up in some sort of cul-de-sac where we cannot move one way or another. This is negotiating before a positive majority vote. And this is the thing I think that we should really be considering. So what that means is that the SNP and any other party that supports independence who's standing at the general election would be transparent for the electors and our opponents, and basically say what we are looking for in negotiating with the UK government and the opposition before a general election, so they know exactly what we're talking about. The Scottish Government's role in this, because they are a product of the Westminster system, the Scottish Government does not have the power to dissolve the Union. It's our MPs who have the power to dissolve the Union, because they are there as a result of the Treaty of Union. However, there is a role, obviously a substantial role for the Scottish Government here, because there are a number of people that would assess whether to vote for the dissolution of union based on risk to themselves and their families, the material risk. So it really is important that the Scottish Government ensures that the policies it pursues in the next 12 to 15 months are truly national policies, and that they appeal to the widest possible audience in the Scottish electorate. And they use the powers that they've got, as I've mentioned before. Proper land reform, they could bring that in very quickly to actually increase their budget significantly, to basically ensure that there was more than sufficient funds in the control of the Scottish Government and not through HMRC, to make sure that none of our population were materially disadvantaged by the fact of our dissolution. There would be a need to set up an independence delivery group, and this would basically be a group of experts who are committed to independence. They wouldn't necessarily have to be members of the SNP, but an awful lot of heavy lifting has already been done on currency, banking, and all these kind of things. Constitution. We have a constitution more or less ready, to get us over the line. To prosecute these very, very quickly and have them in the public domain, as well as the delivery group would also be responsible for basically controlling what we give the media and ensuring that the information which is going out reach such a momentum that people wouldn't think that it might happen, but that it will happen. And basically that they would be inspired with confidence, to vote for the dissolution at the forthcoming general election. Well, will the UK government and or their opposition negotiate? Because it would be important that it wouldn't just be the UK government that would have to negotiate or be invited to negotiate, but also the official opposition. Now, I fully expect that the initial response would be, well, we're not negotiating anything. But of course, as time wore on during as the election drew closer and closer, and even if the polls showed something like, 40% for dissolution and 60% against, that would have quite a significant effect on the reaction of the unionists as to how they deal with that. Because, if we were going to be leaving the day after the election on a majority vote, then that's it, So we're giving them the opportunity to negotiate with us before the election so that things can be agreed, always subject to there being a majority of people voting for independent supporting parties at the general election. So it gives them an opportunity to do that. They won't want that, of course, and also it makes it very difficult for Labour and the Tories because they're then fighting on two fronts. They're fighting each other to become the government of the United Kingdom or whatever it's going to be called after that. And they're also fighting to try and save a union. So from an electoral point of view, that makes it really, really difficult for them. And of course, that is something that would benefit us. There's also the reaction of unionists in Scotland. How do they respond to that? Do they get into bed with the Tories and Labour? Do they try and, be obstructive? We don't know. But anyway, that's something that we would need to obviously consider. There would be effects, as I say, of opinion polls. If there was a momentum built up, and the fear of risk was dissipated and people were inspired. If the opinion polls showed that there was a possibility that we would win this, the reaction again of the unionists and particularly the political parties down south would, I think, show a marked change of emphasis. And we may well find, for example, that in the weeks before the general election, that there would be a number of ships leaving Coalport, etc., with certain things that we would be quite happy to see the back of anyway before the election. But a dissolution with agreement is what we were looking for, because we basically want to encourage the UK government and opposition to negotiate with us before the election. And that would be good for everybody because we know exactly where we were. But as I say, you can have a dissolution without agreement. And the beauty of that is, rather than UDI, is because we're not a colony. Under international law, if there is no agreement, until such time as both parties can agree the detail or an overall plan, one former partner cannot unilaterally make decisions on what was formerly a shared institution or shared common property of the former United Kingdom. So if we take something like the Bank of England, which is a national institution, a UK national institution, it would not be in the gift of the Chancellor of the Exchequer of ENWA to instruct the Governor of the Bank of England to do something without the agreement of the Finance Minister in Scotland. Now, they might try and do that, but of course, all these decisions to put them into effect have got to be done by civil servants. And if the Provisional Scottish Government included in its declaratory act of dissolution that these civil servants, if they carried out any operations which were considered to be materially adverse to the interests of Scotland, then as a result of that, they could be personally liable both in civil law and also in criminal law. Now, a lot of them might never want to come to Scotland or anything like that, after we are independent. But having said that, many of them are Scottish. Many of them have property interests in Scotland. And also, it's not a particularly nice thing to have hanging over your head for the rest of your life, if you do the dirty in Scotland, because, you will always have that, and that restricts your movement, basically, to a certain extent for the rest of your days. So without an agreement, it largely suspends the operation of the former United Kingdom. So it then forces the other side to basically get around the table and sort things out. But because we still are entitled to what's called a joint and several right and liability for the assets and liabilities of and responsibilities of the former United Kingdom until an agreement is set, that puts us in an incredibly powerful position. Because although we might just be 1/8 the population of the UK, in these negotiations, we are equal partners in respect of, what is or what is not agreed. So that's where we're at. And of course, international reaction with a dissolution would be that they would be anxious for these things to be resolved from membership of NATO, UN, etc., etc. So it would put tremendous pressure on Nwani's government to come to the table and get these things sorted out. Otherwise, every decision that is made cannot be unilateral. It's got to be made with the consent of Nwani, and it's got to be agreed with the consent of Scotland too. Independence Delivery Group. Now, this is the composition of this, as I say, would need to be established with people who are experts. Now, there have been a host of opinions on, as I say, on currency and finance and banking, goodness knows what else. And really, for the next 14 to 15 months, these experts would basically need to get around a table and agree, look, we have got to do something to get us over the line. And we might have our own pet views on modern monetary theory or whatever, but let's just get things over the line, and there are things that we can agree to there. We would require a declaratory act to be drafted by legal draftsmen, and that could be done beforehand and ready to be enacted the day after the general election. It would need to involve fundraising to ensure that there were the funds to maintain the delivery group over the period of 14 months or whatever. And we would probably want that to the composition to exclude most civil servants, because we don't want them to feel that they've got a conflict of interest between the UK government and the independence movement during the period before the dissolution took place. We would also want the delivery group to have been controlled basically of the media information, which is going to the media, so that is done in our terms. And also how it would advise the Scottish Government and how it could buy the votes. Because let's face it, an election, that's what it's all about. It's buying votes. That's what political parties do. And we need to know how we could buy the votes of the extra votes that we require to have a comfortable majority. Say we need to create a climate of expectation and inevitability. It wouldn't be what if Scotland can become independent or will become independent, so that people believe that that's going to happen. Also, as I've mentioned, address the fear of individuals, the fear of risk, and part and parcel of that would be to guarantee public service employment and contracts, such as the people that work for BA Systems, and obviously our civil servants too, and how the new civil service department in Scotland would be created. We would also have to undermine the British state and the civil service. And there's perfectly legal ways that you can do that, and we should be open about that, because you cannot create a new Scottish state without undermining the British state. It's just impossible. As I say, in currency and banking, mortgages, the police, we need to know, what the reaction of the Chief Constable will be on dissolution. I've actually submitted to the Police Board of Scotland a freedom of information request to establish what questions were asked of the applicants on the constitutional position, and to include whether things such as UDI, dissolution, etc., what the reaction of the police constable would be to that, and I am waiting a reply. We've also got to turn the previous negatives into positives, whether that's currency, defence, because there's positive messages there to be put, and also pensions, which is an incredibly important thing, both private pensions and the effect of dissolution on private pensions, but also the opportunity to improve the state basic pension. And also there's issues about the borders and export markets and how these would be affected. But because borders is to a certain extent a reserved matter on dissolution without an agreement, it would mean the border would have to basically stay open. That would be, obviously to the benefit of both sides. And of course, that is what's going to happen at the end of the day. We are going to have an open border between the two former states. I finished this off with just a resolution that was submitted to the SNP conference committee. And unfortunately, it's not appeared on the draft agenda, albeit we are trying to get the committee to consider it either by way of an amendment to the ones which they have put on, and we'll see how it goes. But basically, it just says that we declare that Scotland is a sovereign country. We ask the Scottish Government to ensure that it uses the powers it has got so that dissolution does not prejudice the basic financial security of our citizens. We commit all our members to prosecute the dissolution of the United Kingdom at the forthcoming election. And we basically say that what would happen is that on a positive vote the day after the election, the SNP MPs, and inviting others from other parties too, to withdraw from Westminster, declare the dissolution of the Union, create a provisional government of Scotland, remove the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom Supreme Court, and advise the United Nations and the international community that the kingdom is resolved, and that we will adhere to the Vienna Convention on the succession of states in respect of state property, and declare that Scotland will take responsibility on an equitable basis for the rights and obligations of the former United Kingdom. That's it. Thank you.
Wow.
Quite easy.
Yeah.
Fascinating talk. So much to think about there. A couple of things that jumped straight into my mind. The bit where you say we would be equal partners in the UK's assets and obligations. Is that not us agreeing to take on trillions of pounds of UK debt?
Well, I suppose to some extent that depends on whether you believe in modern monetary theory or not. But no, it doesn't, because basically, in terms of the Vienna Convention, it says that the debt should be equitable, the responsibilities and the rights should be equitable. So the division, whether it's assets, responsibilities, would be equitable. And equitable doesn't mean equal; it means fair. Now, as I've said before, the convention does not strictly apply because it was promulgated before long after the Treaty of Union. But it basically restates what was the customary law of international treaties, prior to that being basically codified. The other thing to remember too is, Nwani will be absolutely desperate to be classed as a continuing state. So the price of that, subject to whatever agreement is eventually struck, would be that, they would take their share of what the liabilities and the assets would be. So I don't find that as a problem at all. As I say, all these things eventually will need to be agreed some way or resolved some way. But if we use the fallback position of the Vienna Convention, then we have an equitable liability and not an equal liability.
Great, thank you. That really that was a useful clarification, I think. I mean, the other thing that just occurs to me is, do we have time to do all this if we've got to set up groups to construct our offer, if you like? If the next general election is going to be in 15 months, that seems like an awful lot for us to do from a standing start.
Well, it is a lot to do, but if we're really serious, somebody will shout out, "When do you want independence?" And we shout out, "Now." Well, if we mean that, got to do it. But in times of crisis, or in times of opportunity with small windows, you do it. And you can do it. It's a matter of basically having the focus on doing it. And as I say, so much of the heavy lifting has been done. Not everything has to be done before we dissolve, but as long as we have that framework in place, and we also have the funding arrangements so that we have the source of public funding in place, then these are the main things to have. Because let's face it, I think under the Edinburgh Agreement, our transition period was going to be something like, was it 18 months? 18 months isn't much longer than 14 or 15 months. So, these things can be put in place. I don't really have a worry about that. I've always found that there is a way through things that they can be done. And sometimes it's actually better not acquiring a bit of what you were formerly part of. Rather, you're better doing it, from the start. And we have examples of that. For example, in the security issue, I have heard it said by experts that, if Scotland wants to set up its own security system, the best examples of that are the Baltic states. It's not what Britain has just now. And of course, with technology, etc., having moved on tremendously, there is so much that can be done that we can do without worrying about the the issue of timescales. We will have to concentrate the mines. There'll be a lot of mines that will have to be concentrated, but you can concentrate them for 12 to 15 months, and then, you're independent. And that's what we all profess to say that we want. Not that, oh yes, we want to be independent, but not now. That's and I actually think this is the best opportunity we have ever had. But we've got to focus on it and put all our efforts into it, and we can do it. Because I really do despair that we will get another opportunity like this, in the next 10, 15, 20 years. We will not get cooperation from a UK government, whether it's Tory or Labour. We won't get that. We've got to actually have a threat and a sanction and say, if you do not negotiate with us, well, we're off. And that's what we've got to do. But in order to do that, we've got to take that element of risk, personal risk, that people might well feel, and the nervousness they might well feel, that, they are materially adversely affected or potentially by this. And that's why the Scottish Government's got to use the powers it's got just now in order to create the funds and the wealth, which it can do. Why it's been so timorous, I don't know. But that's what it's got to do, and create the funds so that HMRC can't get their hands on this. And we can then move with confidence. But this is not going to be done by some gentleman's agreement. Independence, you've got to take it. And we are dealing with basically political thugs in Westminster.
So there's a couple of points I wanted to just raise. One is about the Vienna Convention. So I noticed that you said it has provision there for dividing up not just the liabilities but the assets. So yes, UK's got a lot of liabilities, but the UK has huge assets, so it would be both. So that's reassuring. But I just wondered. You said it was drawn up 1985. I think what prompted it? What did it emerge from?
I think basically what happened was that the UN, obviously the UN was developed after the Second World War, and it gradually wanted to build up some structure, not just to itself, but also to regulate or attempt to regulate the position when certain events happened internationally, where states broke up, and there was some form of structure to that, and I don't know why it was specifically. I think the first Vienna Convention, I think, was late 60s, early 70s, but of course it takes a number of years to be ratified until they've got umpteen, they've got to a certain number of countries that ratify these things, and that's the kind of time it took. It may well be that it was to just respond to certain countries which had split, and of course there was quite a potential movement of countries that were possibly former colonies, etc., or countries that had been colonies and then they split again. There's all sorts. I mean, there's just been so many. When you think about there's so many different events and how countries have been created and, countries have dissolved or split up, I think they just wanted to give some sort of structure to that. It's been ratified by a considerable number of countries in states, including the UK. So, it is basically the kind of, shall we say, the settled international law or legal framework.
Good.
I mean, we know that the United Kingdom, has flouted international law itself. I mean, the Caicos Islands, I think, is the most recent example where they just ignored the will there of the people. So, international law is breached by a number of states when it suits them. But I think if you are dealing with the actual dissolution of the UK itself, that's a different kettle of fish altogether.
That's really helpful. I might go and read up a bit about the Vienna Convention, as you do. But so the other thing I just wanted to ask a wee bit more about. So it was towards the end of your presentation there, and you were talking about, the Scottish government can use the powers that it has already to sort of ready the situation or the landscape, as it were, of what we might be moving into. So you're someone that we've always talked to before about land tax and reforming that. So that would presumably something that the Scottish government can do. But so are there other things that specific things that you'd like to see them doing to kind of lay the ground, as it were?
That comment that I've made is based on the land reform and the introducing land as the principal source of public funding, which beyond any shadow of a doubt will raise far more money than all the other forms of taxation, which either the devolved administration has power over or indeed the United Kingdom government has power over. So in the run-up to the dissolution, the Scottish Government could introduce my form of annual ground rent or a similar form to that, and they could do that really, really quickly. It's really a very simple thing to set up because, again, most of the institutions and the elements of it are already in place. So that could be done. And that then is the source of funding which goes direct to Revenue Scotland and doesn't go anywhere near HMRC. It benefits virtually everybody financially. But in addition, so that's Section 80I of the Scotland Act. And I may say just in passing that basically Section 80I refers to taxation on transactions involving an interest in land. Now, transactions doesn't just mean buying and selling. A transaction can just be the delivery of your rates notice or your council tax notice. That's a transaction under Scots law. Or making a will is a transaction, albeit it's just one person that signs it. So that's it. So it's not necessarily sales and purchases. So in addition to that, it is possible just now for the Scottish Government to tax the heritable property of our energy suppliers. Now, they've got pipes and cables going all over the country. I mean, thousands of miles, thousands of miles of these. And because that is a heritable asset under Scots law, they could actually, charge them for that just now. So there's another wee thing that they could do, or a pretty big thing, in fact. I think I worked out it was £32, in theory, £32 per square, per metre length would raise enough money so that everybody in this country, whether they were a private individual or a company, wouldn't have to pay energy if that money was refunded by the Scottish Government to consumers, private consumers and also commercial consumers. It's things like that we've got to think about and do. The other side of it is Section 28, and that's a really interesting one because we have heard some of our ministers, etc., say, we don't have the power to set up a universal basic income without the consent of the UK government. Well, that is wrong. What it says is that 28 basically allows the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, to create benefits as long as they are not paid for by the Consolidated Fund, which is HMRC, or the National Insurance Fund. pensions and things of that nature. So a universal basic income is not a pension, and it's not being, under my proposals, it wouldn't be funded by any UK government funding at all. It would be funded by the model of annual ground rent that I'm suggesting. So we can do these things now, and we can set them up very quickly. I mean, the Scottish Government has the national insurance number for every resident in Scotland who's registered with national insurance, so we've got that. So, you know, it just needs the political will to do it, and we can do these things.
Although, given that we've not successfully managed to get through legislation like a simple deposit return scheme or the GRA paperwork, you know, without Alistair Jack's head exploding and coming down on us like a ton of bricks, I can just imagine his face if we tell him we're going to tax every metre of oil pipeline.
I mean, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Alistair Jack, you know, became, I was going to say the 6th country to end up on the moon, but with that, but he might self-propel himself into that. But I mean, the position is that, you know, if the UK government challenged these things, such as, you know, as bringing in the model of annual ground rent or the you know, the universal citizens' income or basic income for everybody, say £200 a week, that's actually grist to our mill.
Yeah.
Because, you know, unlike the GRA and things like that, which are important, but I mean, they actually affect a relatively small section of our population. This is affecting everybody. And particularly in a time when, you know, people and a lot of people are really suffering, to think that they could have another £200 in their hand every week, you know, it would make the difference between existence and living. And it's these things. So, you know, that would propel us towards independence anyway if they tried to stop it. I don't know. I mean, I just find that, you know, we seem to be a bit timorous. And I've always found in my professional life, you know, if you challenge authority, it's amazing how they back off. You know?
So say, the general election and there's a majority of votes cast for independent supporting candidates. So that kind of like sets this all in motion. So one of the options was if there's no negotiation, or I think maybe it was either way, that the Scottish MPs would withdraw from Westminster, but it'll only be the SNP MPs. I'm sure that other independent supporting parties will get votes, but they won't get seats, not under first past the post. So it'll be the SNP taking themselves out. Now, at the moment, that would still leave 6 or 7 MPs. After the general election, might be more than that. So then you've got a bit of a rump of Scottish MPs still hanging in there in Westminster. What happens at that point?
Well, they can do what they like, to be quite honest, where they are. But I mean, we're moving on. Once the UK is dissolved, it's dissolved, and you know they can do whatever they like, and they can say whatever they like. But when there is a majority vote in favour, and that it manifests itself in the new provisional government of Scotland, which immediately enacts the Declaratory Act. Now, the Declaratory Act can take different forms, but it'd be a relatively simple act. And one option it would have would be basically to say that it declares that the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood is now sovereign. It could say that. And transfer these powers, because it's the Scottish MPs would have the power to basically assign their rights to the Scottish Parliament. But that's the way it's got to be done. Scottish Parliament can't do that itself because it is a creation of Westminster. The Scottish MPs are not a creation of Westminster. They are a creation of the Treaty of Union.
Yeah,
and that's really the point. But that would be one way it could be done. Another way it could be done would be for the provisional government to say, no, we will retain the powers meantime until we hold a general election at such and such a time, 6 months, 9 months, something like that. But obviously there would be a coming together of civic Scotland. You know, we might call it a convention or all the rest of it, but the convention actually gets into play once the deed is done, and we move forward with that. That's for that. But the crucial to this is the Independence Delivery Unit, being people with expertise in the different functions that I've said, and bringing all this information together. So what we're doing is we're front loading the transition period before the general election and not after it. That is extremely powerful, and also it takes it out of the orbit of the Westminster system, because, as I say, the civil servants would not be involved in this prior to the general election, but it would be people with expertise that know what they're doing just as well as civil servants know what they're doing, about how you transition and you set up all these sort of frameworks and institutions so they're ready to go the day after. The day after the general election. And the other thing to remember is that, of course, there'll be a lot that won't be set up in time, but because under dissolution we are an equal partner, NWANE cannot decide, just to do things unilaterally for these things, because the UK has ceased to exist. So it's got to agree on an item by item term, what can be done, whether, it's propping up the pound, because we will share the pound for a period of time, obviously, or what way, our commitments for defence and overseas, etc., that kind of thing. These are things that would need to be decided, agreed equally, until we get down to basically finalising the agreement of how we divide our assets and liabilities, etc., etc. That's it.
Wow.
Wow.
I can see the attraction of giving people a vote when the negotiation has been done, because then you know what you're voting for. How much support you're going to get from that remains to be seen, but fascinating. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. We will get it out to our YouTube channel. We'll do an audio version as well. Smashing.
Thank you again. The one thing I will say in conclusion, if you're somebody like me at my age, and maybe a bit younger, what if you believe in Scottish independence? What is the best legacy you can give your children, your grandchildren? Is it to leave them £1,000, or is it to contribute £1,000 to deliver independence and the opportunities that they will have, in the years and decades to come afterwards? And I think that's what we've got to start focusing on. It's not a hobby. This is a real mission, and we've got to be evangelists for that. And we can do it if we believe it. And I think we've just got to focus completely on this for the next 12 to 15 months.
Fantastic. Right. Thank you so much.
Thanks then. Bye.
Okay, so plenty of food for thought there, and thanks again to Graeme for coming and talking us through it. We've been keeping track of how many different routes to independence people are coming up with, and it's safe to say there's no shortage of different options that people are thinking about. Which one ends up being the route we take still remains to be seen. But for now, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for watching, and we will catch you next time. Bye now.
Bye.